Thank you, Bruno. That's a very kind and humbling introduction. So thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So EPOC has been, at Leeds, we're an associate partner of Leeds, and we always get some really, really good EPOC students. I have some very good friends, and actually one co-author on this paper is an ex-EPOC student. So it's brilliant to be finally here and see all of you extremely good students. So the paper I have chosen to present here, it's got a bit of an unwieldy title, but it's basically a study of financialization behavior of non-financial corporations in Brazil and Turkey. So it's a comparative case. It's not reacting to, hold on, how do I change the slides? It's not reacting to my computer, Sorry, we should have tested that before. We just assumed it would work. Okay. What do I need to do? Just on the mouse? Yeah. Yes, and to go back? Okay, cool. Yes, wonderful. Yeah, so it's a paper that looks at the financialization behavior, or whatever let's say financial behavior of non-financial corporations in Brazil and in Turkey. So it's a comparative case study, and as I will show later, it's a mixed method study. So we're combining quantitative data analysis, which mainly Joel Rabinovic, who is an ex-EPOC student, was responsible for, you know his name, with qualitative interviews in Brazil and Turkey, which Elif, my very good friend who is Turkish, and I conducted over 10 years. So I was just, when I was preparing for this presentation and reminiscing. So I started doing interviews for this paper when I was pregnant with my first boy, who just turned 10 before Christmas. So it really took us 10 years to do this paper. And it has only just recently come out in Socioeconomic Review, which we're very happy about. So in a way, that paper does two things. On the one hand, and I think that's the starting point, it engages, you want that panel to be gone again. It engages with the literature on corporate financialization, or the financialization of the firm. So a good 10 years when we started that paper, the literature on corporate financialization was very, very active. That's when the financialization literature was kind of emerging. And there were all these seminal papers by Stockhammer, Orhangazi, Firat Demir, etc., looking at financialization of the firm. And now large parts of the majority of that literature focused on firms in the global north, and as it's mostly the case, on firms in the US and the UK, because these are the most financialized ones. And as a global south scholar, of course, we came to that literature asking, well, do we really think, or in a way with a very open research question, open mind. So our question was really, are we observing the same patterns of financial behavior, financial patterns, financial manifestations in the global south? And if so, and if not, what are the channels of transmissions? So are there any specificities about countries in the global south when it comes to this financialization behavior? And for those, who know my work, where I'm coming from is, so, I come from I define myself as a macrostructural development economist. So I come from a tradition of, as Bruno de Conti, what we call currency hierarchy literature. So really and I'm not a very creative scholar, and I think I will probably all my life do the same thing. Basically, the thing I come from is this perception or this knowledge or this understanding that the global economy is fundamentally structured and hierarchic. And it's structured in production, so I'm sure you're doing stuff on global value chains, etc., but it's also structured and hierarchic when it comes to monetary and financial dynamics. And probably the easiest expression, or the most visible expression of that, is the dominance of the dollar, which, who knows what's going to happen with Trump, which dominates the global financial system. But what we are looking at is really, and there's a lot of work on the dollar, but what we are looking at is really what are the layers or echelons below that, and where are currencies sitting on a hierarchy below that, and most importantly, what implications does that have for these economies? And these implications range from monetary policy, macro policy, but also, and we'll come back to that particularly in this paper, how does it fundamentally structure the behavior and the space and the agency of countries, agents in the global south? And here we're looking at corporates. So what this paper then also does, let's see whether I can emancipate myself and get rid of this myself. Here you go, I managed. So what this paper then does more broadly, it contributes to that literature on international financial subordination and subordinate financialization that really looks at this hierarchic monetary and financial structures and tries to ask, well, how does this shape agency, or what kind of constitutes these hierarchical structures? So what I want to do in this paper then is, I know I was... Yes, okay. So I was in touch with the students beforehand, and they asked, and we had a little bit of a chat, what should I focus on? And they asked me to focus on these papers, on the firm behavior, which I will do. But what I still would like to do beforehand is to give a little bit of a background on this research agenda of international financial subordination, just to frame it a bit more broadly, and also to make a call for those of you who are interested in that topic to look into it and see whether it's in any way productive or constructive for you. And maybe just to kind of mention a few things here, just to show you, I'm also an editor of Development and Change, which is a critical development journal, and we're going to edit a forum on international financial subordination in a couple of years' time. So if anybody's doing their master's dissertation on it, or if any of you is thinking in a PhD thesis, then keep that in mind. And we're always very interested in new stuff. And honestly, the best work is being done by young scholars like you, coming out of their masters and going into their PhD. And we're also going to have a stream at the Association for Heterodox Economics conference in June, if anybody's interested in that, on international financial subordination. So that's a bit of an advertising plug, but I still wanted to give a little bit of a background just for you to see how this more specific work on firms fits into this more general research agenda which we're working on and which we're seeking to develop. Then I'm going to go briefly into the literature on corporate financialization. It's quite a big literature, but I want to give a brief overview just to show you also how this paper contributes to it. Then I'm going to briefly talk to you about our methodology, and finally our main findings. If there are any questions in between, please do interrupt and just lift your hand. There is nothing, honestly, from a teacher perspective, there is nothing worse than speaking for 45 minutes and seeing how the heads slowly droop and how the attention goes. So please do interrupt me and come up with questions. Raise your hand in between if there are any issues, because it also breaks the flow a little bit. Okay. Now, let's then briefly talk about or introduce to you this agenda on international financial subordination. So it comes out, is again a baby of love from the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years, and basically emerged from 6 of us, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, actually 7 of us, including me, coming together. I think in 2018 we had a little workshop on financialization in developing countries, coming together and saying, well, why don't we do something about this kind of, this empirical observation and also kind of conceptualization, which we all had started, which kind of identifies the specific roles of developing countries in the monetary and global monetary and financial system. So this kind of vulnerability, the volatile capital flows, the financial crises, the currency mismatches, the exchange rate depreciations, etc., etc. And thought, well, let's think about this a bit more broader. Let's try to conceptualize that. And let's maybe try to do a research agenda around that. And in the first instance, that was just mainly motivated by us just being so sick of going to academic conferences and being plugged into the random panel at 8 o'clock in the morning when nobody shows up. FMM conference, I don't know how often I've presented at 8 o'clock in the morning where there were 2 people in the room, yeah? And then my mates who were doing something similar were at 4 o'clock on the Friday afternoon where nobody else showed up either. Said, you know what, why don't we make a research agenda so that at least if somebody organizes a conference knows that we fit together. They can still put us in the 8 o'clock panel, but at least we're together. That gives us a critical mass. Yeah. So this was the main motivation to the people. But then, a joke aside, there was also a political purpose, because actually once we say there is such a thing as international financial subordination, and believe us, it took us a year to actually agree on this term. We were 7 people, Marxists, post-Keynesians, dependency theory scholars, so it took us ages to decide that it was actually international financial subordination. But there was also a political purpose about it, because once we say there is such a thing as international financial subordination, we thought it could be actually really productive and constructive for people to just point at this and say, look, this is a thing, this happens. Don't treat developing countries like any country else. Don't, treat it like like France, because they have a specific position in the international economy. And we felt that whilst that was kind of established on the productive side, so there's this research agenda in global value chain, supply chains, etc., etc. They have their own panels at conferences, 7 panels at conferences. We didn't have any of that. So this is then where it come about. They said, okay, let's make international financial subordination a thing, and let's write a paper about this. And this is then that paper that came out in 2023, I think, in RIPE. Where we tried to do that. And I think so far, we are working on the forum issue now, we were kind of reflecting that. I think so far, it has kind of partly filled that purpose. So, the paper has been quite widely cited, people are picking it up. At the moment, they're picking it up more as a kind of cross-reference. This is a thing, which we wanted, so that's fine. We haven't seen so much additional empirical work and digging deeper into this, but hopefully that's going to come over the next years. So that's the background to international financial subordination. Now, how do we define it? So we spent the second year of that paper fighting about how we define international financial subordination. And at some point, Elias Alamy, one of the Marxist representatives and the one who is a brilliant writer, if anybody of you knows his work, then basically put his foot down and decided, right, this is our definition, and this is how we're defining it. So IFS suggests a relation that is both spatial and saturated with power, a relation of domination, authority, and subjugation between different spaces across the world market, expressed in and through money and finance. So money and finance exercises power, which penalizes actors in these disproportionately. So there's a sense that money always expresses power. Monetary relations, credit relations is always power. But that power is disproportionately exercised in developing and emerging countries because of their specific position in the global financial system. It expresses itself as constrained on agency. Yeah, so if there are any Brazilians in this room, there's a lot of discussion in Brazilian academia of how, somebody's nodding back there, somehow, this kind of currency hierarchy constrains agency, etc., although my Marxist friends are saying, well, anyway, I'll come back to that. So it's expressed as a constraint on agency and as a geographical transfer of value. So just think about the structurally high interest rates in many developing countries. That's a structural transfer of value, where I'm also working on Africa now, where the Zambian government issuing a bond will have to pay 3 times, 4 times the interest rate than a French government or a German government. And of course, some of that might be related to macroeconomic situation, but there's also what has been shown, a distinct Africa premium, for example, that there's a risk perception which is just added on top and absorbs a lot of fiscal expenditure of the Zambian government, which could spend that on health, education, etc. Yeah. It's directly implicated in the geographical transfer of value, and it significantly contributes to broader patterns of uneven spatial development. So we do think that international financial subordination isn't just ephemeral, but has a substantial impact on development more generally, and structures development, and affects the day-to-day operations of actors, which then feeds back into things like productive structure, institutional setup, etc., etc. What else? Well, we argue that international financial subordination is also structural. So this subordinate position, or this vulnerability of developing and emerging countries in monetary and financial markets, isn't, or maybe not always, a result of misaligned domestic policy failures, high inflation, lax fiscal situation, but it's related to the asymmetric structure of production. So the fact that these countries are concentrated in very often in low value added activities or commodity exports with very little technological advancement and value added. And it's related to the structure of the global monetary and financial system. Monetary, I've already discussed the dominant position of the dollar, but also important, the spatial setup and topography of global finance. So the fact that global finance is concentrated in financial centers, which are, surprise, surprise, located in London and Washington, makes a massive difference to this kind of tendency. Because if you're based in London, you're going to fund yourself in London. So here's my Minskian side coming through for those of you who are interested in Minsky. You know, you fund yourself in London, you fund yourself in dollar or in pounds. Once you have liabilities in dollar and in pounds, it's the dollar and the pounds which you will need to generate to meet your liabilities, right? And then suddenly you have a dominant currency which might not be justified by economic fundamentals at all anymore. So if you look at the UK at the moment, where I'm based, I was joking before, the UK is now a global south and the north. In terms of GDP per capita, some areas, I mean, you know, some houses around where I live don't have windows. So it's, but they have the pound, they have the city. And so this kind of spatial agglomeration of finance makes a massive difference. So it's structural, okay? It's not just policy, it's structural. Right, emancipate myself again. And then the second thing is it's not just that, but it's also systemic. So for the kind of more Marxist scholars among us, it's very important to also highlight it's part and parcel of the capitalist system, because the capital system builds and feeds on unevenness. It needs it because there need to be spaces where they can generate returns. You know, they can exploit labor, that's where the value is created, but they can also exploit the periphery, okay? So subordination is inherent of part of global capitalism in the creation, transfer, storage, and realization of value in the global scale. I'm just going to leave this now, because otherwise I'm going to be emancipating myself 3 times on each slide, which, you know. And then what we do in this paper, so this kind of, this theorization is based on reflecting these 7 people which were writing that paper. So it kind of brings together so it kind of looks at 3 macrostructural theories to build that international financial subordination concept, which are dependency theory, which has the core periphery tendency. It's the post-Keynesian literature and currency hierarchy, where I come from, where really money and monetary hierarchies using Keynes's liquidity preference theories at the core, and then also Marxist scholars of world money and imperialism. Yeah, so these are the authors like Jeff Powell and Elias Alamy who were part of this. And so what we do in this paper, I'm not going to go into this, but we bring these theories together in order to make international financial subordination a thing. And yeah, I can remove the bar. It just keeps on coming back very often. So. It's a boring bar. I will keep on doing this. So what we then do that paper, and this is what we do in that paper too, and this is how we are linking now in the paper. I'm actually due to present, but it was important for me to kind of give this broader framing, is we identify 6 axes which we think could, in a way, center such a research agenda. So we say, okay, let's do something, guys. Let's work on international financial subordination. And then looking at the literature, we identify these 6 axes, which we think these could be potentially interesting areas. It's not prescriptive, of course, there are many, you know, and many other areas, but these could be potentially interesting areas to look at, and there are kind of some open tensions and discussions around international financial subordination. And these are, just very briefly, for those of you interested, you can read the paper, but these are basically history and how international financial subordination transmutes and changes itself. And subordinate financialization is the current manifestation of international financial subordination in financialized capitalism. Then social relations of production, so the symbiotic relationship between monetary and productive hierarchies, and this is where this paper directly feeds into, because monetary hierarchies have to be seen in that symbiosis with production structure and vice versa. Yeah. Then the role of money, the role of the state, and this is, I think, that's a very interesting research area going forward, partly because of the question, you know, is it a constraint on state, or is the state actually, like in Marxist political economy, a reflection of class interests or class relations which are being navigated in this context of international financial subordination? And also with the return of the state. You know, I keep on making that comment in a way that the climate crisis, you know, there's a silver lining with everything. It's very small in the climate crisis. But one thing that we have observed in the discourse is that the state is back. People are talking about industrial policy, people are talking about the role of the state, and that really also from a global south perspective raises the question again, well, what is the space of the state in the global south in order, for example, to do the ecological transition, right? To do that financing, which is so required, and are we observing a new developmental state, etc.? So I think this is a really interesting research area. Then the other axis was the role of agency. And again, I think that's where the paper really fits in neatly, in the sense that we're really looking at corporates, at firms. So how are firms operating within this context of monetary and financial subordination? And then finally pondering to the geographers having a more scalar relation of understanding of IFS. So these are the 6 axes which we describe in the paper, in the research agenda paper. And what I'm going to present now is how firms behave or operate within IFS, which particularly speaks to axes 2, 4, and 5. Production, the state, and daily practices. Okay, I'm going to make a quick pause here. Does anybody have any comments or questions to that? Is there anything that it would be good to elaborate further? No. Okay, I'm just going to take my jumper off, because it was minus 10 degrees in Leeds at the moment, which I haven't. I'm from Austria. I haven't experienced that. Such cold weather in the UK. Okay, well then let's have a look at the paper. So what do we do then in the corporate financialization paper? Okay. So just a very brief overview of the literature on corporate financialization, which we started out with 10 years ago. Actually, I was still doing my, no, I wasn't doing my PhD. I was just coming out of my PhD, but it came out of my kind of the PhD motivation. So basically what we found, as I've already indicated a little bit, so there was this, or there is and was this extensive literature on the changing financial practice of non-financial corporations under financial capitalism. And I've given a few of the core readings here, or core references here, but in a nutshell, what people have observed is that firms, which normally should engage in production, have been increasingly involved with financial markets. And we have observed that both on the asset side and on the liability side. So on the asset side, firms have been holding, or at least authors have thought to show that firms have been holding more short-term financial assets, and have made financial income. So the implication is that they have made more gains from speculative financial holdings rather than the underpinning productive operations. They have increased their market-based liabilities. So they have, on the one hand, increased their liabilities. They have borrowed more, but they also have done it more through markets. So rather than banks, firms have borrowed on bond markets. So we have a rise, and of course equity markets, so shareholder markets. And that has then led to an increase in financial payouts, both in the form of interest rates and dividends, which, I'm not going so much into that literature, but a large part of that literature then tests econometrically whether that has had a negative implication for capital investments and real accumulation. So the seminal papers by Orhangazi and Stockhammer, etc., then show that this increase or this changing behavior of firms and the increase in payouts, for example, has led to a decline in capital accumulation and real accumulation, and has such affected the real economy. Now, there has been a bit of a, and actually Joel Rabinowitz is one of the key authors in that strand, there has been a bit of a kind of criticism on that literature recently to say, actually, it's not that clear when you really dig into the data whether firms have actually made money and whether firms have actually done speculative operations or haven't held these liquid assets for other things, for example, tax reasons or mergers and acquisitions, etc. And there's also very important work by Brett Christophers, among others, a brilliant geographer, who showed that very often in these accounts, basically financial income is linked to overseas income. So basically financial income and overseas income are recorded in the same category, and you can't distinguish whether it's a financial income or whether it's income from offshore subsidiaries, etc. So what he's arguing is that actually what a lot of authors have picked up isn't financialization, but it's basically globalization and outsourcing. Yeah. So there is that kind of side literature, but nevertheless, let's take this financialization of the firm literature as a face value and say and ask the question, well, how does it manifest and how does it emerge in developing and emerging countries? And there is significantly less, but there is some literature which is looking at that. And what that literature has shown is that we have seen also a rise in liquid financial assets of firms in the global south. I think 3/4 of that literature on Brazil. But in contrast to the literature on the global north, actually what that literature seems to show is that has been mainly in the form of cash. So rather than holding financial assets, these firms have been really holding money. Yeah, so they've been holding on to money. And at the same time, we have seen, and I think this is real, and the Bank for International Settlements for a very long time was concerned that the next financial crisis sits in the non-financial corporations, because what we have seen, particularly before the COVID crash, is that we have seen quite significant increases in debt levels of a lot of non-financial corporations, Chinese, Turkish, Brazilian, etc., etc., and a lot of that, as I will show you later, in foreign currencies. So they have been borrowing offshore, which often isn't represented in the national statistics, and they have been doing so in dollar. So for a very long time, the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, etc., were actually really worried that this is where the next financial crisis sits. It hasn't. It's quite interesting. I haven't pursued it further, but it's quite interesting that it hasn't. It has never turned into a financial crisis, but the debt levels are real. And then there are different explanations of this observed financial behavior of firms in the global south. On the one hand, very much in line with the general literature on financialization. Parts of literature argues that it's speculative. They've been holding these financial assets or cash for speculative purpose. Some of them have argued that it's for precautionary purpose, so they're holding on this as a security pillow against uncertainty. And in the liability side, there's a bit of literature, but very little, that basically argues that for firms in the global south, what really matters are the global financial conditions. So if you have abundant liquidity on global financial markets, then these firms will borrow internationally. If it's more restrictive, if interest rates are higher, then they will seek finance domestically if they can, which of course isn't always that given. Okay, so that's basically our starting point in the literature. And what we do, how that paper then contributes to the literature is among several grounds. It's first of all is to say that actually, in very, very few instances of that literature, we look at it in the global south, and we have quite a grounded empirical approach. So we really spent 10 years, and it was really 10 years, plowing through the financial accounts, talking to the firms, trying to understand what's going on. So I think methodologically we are quite different from the existing literature, but also from a conceptual theoretical level. So very seldomly that existing literature looks at the assets and the liabilities in conjunction. So they look at assets and look at the rise in financial income. They look at the liability structure, the rise in debt. But they very seldomly look at that in conjunction. And what we do in the paper is we look at that in conjunction, and actually we ask ourselves that in a way, isn't it paradoxical that on the one hand, you have got these firms who hold increasingly cash, so they're sitting on massive cash pillars, and at the same time they're borrowing like mad, and you would think, well, if you have all that cash, why wouldn't you borrow? I mean, why don't you just take your cash and invest it? So in the first instance, that looks quite paradoxical. In the global north, that has been explained by tax reasons and so on and so forth. In the global south, the only real explanations of what we would think is paradoxical is a thesis put forward by the Bank for International Settlements, and quite actively so actually, that what firms are doing in the global south is that they're doing a form of carry trade. Have you heard about carry trade? No. Okay. Some of you haven't. So basically what carry trade is very simply borrowing in financial markets or currencies which have low interest rates. So you're borrowing the dollar or you're borrowing the pound with relatively low interest rates, and then you invest in high interest rate destinations. So it's basically making money on the interest rate spread. Very often so, particularly now that many of these global south countries also have floating exchange rates, so exchange rates move. Very often the real money actually made in these carry trade operations is through the exchange rate. So if you borrow in the dollar, you invest in the Brazilian real, the real appreciates, then you make a lot of money on the currency, as long as you pull out before the currency depreciates again, and that's the knack, right? But this is basically what's been one of the main financial operations. So when I was doing my PhD, there was loads of literature out there. And basically what the Bank for International Financial Settlements is saying, that big companies or firms, many of which straddle global borders, right? Big firms don't just sit in Brazil. They have a subsidiary in London. They have, what they do is they basically act like little banks. They borrow internationally at low interest rates, and then they invest it domestically at high interest rates, which would explain that concomitant increase in cash and liabilities, right? Because they would be doing that carry trade and they would be making money. And some of them have even argued, there's a very, very interesting paper on Mexico where they argue, but they have proprietary data, so we haven't been able to replicate that or look into that. But what they even argue is that what big Mexican companies have been doing is they have really acted like banks. So they borrowed offshore at low interest rates, and then they passed on that money to their suppliers and to their dependent firms, which in the company accounts is accounts receivables. So they show that there's been a link between the interest rate differential and firms' behavior and the accounts receivables. So they've basically intermediated money to their supplier firms and other things. At least that's one of the hypotheses. Yeah. And that's a little bit our starting point. So what we then really kind of wanted to do is to kind of understand this kind of joint increase in financial assets and financial liabilities, and to really understand what are firms actually doing. Because observationally, it's very equivalent. Are they doing carry trade? Are they holding money for precautionary purpose, etc., etc.? And the other thing that's missing in most of these accounts is this kind of macrostructural approach which we have to really understand firm behavior in this context of international financial subordination, and don't just look at it from a sectoral firm perspective, but really understand how firms operate within the global economy. At the same time, and I've already kind of implied that, the literature on subordinate financialization isn't actually very good yet on these studies of actors. They're very good on the macro stuff, reserve accumulation, exchange rate dynamics. We've spent ages talking about exchange rates, but we haven't really conducted these detailed empirical studies yet. How do the agents in the global south really are affected by these monetary structures? Yeah. Just a bit of a bracket, just to kind of get away from this a little bit, is that so when we edited, it was really interesting actually, so when we edited that special issue in the Cambridge Journal of Economics of financialization in developing countries, we got some of the submissions which did that. And one I found really interesting was a paper, and I can't remember the country, but it was a paper on an African country which showed how the National Development Bank was so fundamentally constrained in providing domestic credits and doing their developmental stuff because of that hierarchy, which I found very, very instructive. And we're doing a little bit of a project at the moment, just to kind of, just to give you a bit of a sense of why this is so important and why we really need to look at these mechanisms. So one project we are doing at the moment is we're looking at local currency lending by multilateral development banks. So the World Bank, the IMF, etc., right? And one big problem, I'm going to run out of time, but I'm going to still tell that story. So one big problem is that all these big financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the European Investment Bank, the EBRD, the Inter-American Development Bank, when they give their loans, guess in what currency they are giving that loan? Dollar. All of them dollar. Now, guess which institutions are one of the key institutions which are intermediating the money the multilateral development banks are giving to, let's say, Guatemala. The money comes from the World Bank, but which are the institutions? I mean, they're giving all kinds of money everywhere, but what I really just learned that over the last 2 months, but so that's why I'm so excited about it. But what are the key institutions which are intermediating or profiting, taking that money and intermediating into the domestic economy? No, but nearly, it's a public institution. Think about the African example I've just given you. Local national development banks. Now, guess what happens? The National Development Bank, because financing costs are so high locally, right? What they do is to take the loans from the World Bank, which is cheaper, but it's in dollar. Who has got the currency mismatch? The National Development Bank. Who is finding it very difficult to provide long-term local currency loan to develop its domestic economy? The National Development Bank. Yeah. So you can see how, and this is why, for those of you who are dabbling, for example, with modern monetary theory, which I have a lot of sympathy with, but that's why, for example, a modern monetary theory result is that, well, we just need national development banks. It's fine, I agree, we need national development banks, but they also need to finance themselves, and they finance themselves in dollars. So just to give an example of why we really need to think through how these macro structures affect domestic agency. But let's go back to our firms. So what then paper does is, what our paper does is to try to address these gaps, looking at the behavior of firms in Brazil and Turkey. Why Brazil and Turkey? Well, because these are the countries we're working on, honestly. The referees wanted some, exactly. This is very often what happens. You know, the referee reports wanted some justification. Luckily enough, they have borrowed a lot, these firms, so we had a justification. But it's just a country to know about. But again, joke aside, they're interesting comparatively because they're both big, they're both quite developed. They are kind of a bit like sub-imperialists in their regions, but they have very different institutional, productive, and political economic characteristics. So as a case study comparison, Brazil and Turkey are actually quite neat. What are we doing in terms of data analysis? I've already hinted at that a little bit. So we're using firm-level data, or Joel has been using firm-level data from publicly listed non-financial corporations in Brazil from 1998 to 2018, and Turkey from 1996 to 2018 from Compass.global. And we particularly look at the assets, sorry, this is asset side, not asset side, cash, short-term investments, deposits, and trade receivables. And on the liability side, we look at short-term and long-term loans and bonds. And then we complement that with national aggregate data, particularly for income. So we wanted to also look at financial income and financial expenditures, because stocks don't tell us yet anything about income. You know, just because I'm holding financial assets and I have financial liabilities doesn't mean I'm actually making money. And then date and firm level data and bond issuance from Thomson Icon. So particularly Joel has really done quite a lot of data gathering exercise to really get a better understanding and comprehensive picture of what these firms are actually doing. And then we combined this with these interviews. So we did 25 semi-structured interviews between 2012, 2012. So it's even 12 years, 13 years when we started, and 2019 in Brazil, Turkey, and the UK. And we spoke to firms, financial institutions, and other experts. Yes?
Yeah, you stopped with Turkey in 2018 when there was a new debt crisis. Is this implemented or not?
We stopped in 18 because this is actually when we did the data analysis. This is how old this, this is how long it has taken us to get that paper out. So we haven't really. But 2018 is actually the time, if I remember right, when the troubles in Turkey just started. Yeah, so that was the time where the rest of the emerging markets were still relatively doing well, but Argentina and Turkey had a wobble, because they had massive current account deficits. So we're picking up a little bit of that, but not the whole, and also not Erdogan's schizophrenic policy, which seems to change by the day. Okay, so this is our methodology. So we do a mixed methods analysis, triangulating what we can see in the data with those interviews. Okay, what do we find? A lot of it I've already hinted at, but I will summarize it. So the first thing is that we also, as with the literature, we do see, at least until the global financial crisis, or at least until, let's say, the Eurozone, end of the Eurozone crisis, we see that Turkish and Brazilian non-financial corporations have increased their liquid financial assets. In Brazil, the increase was quite sustained and quite marked, if you want so, until around 2011. And that's when international conditions are kind of, so you can see how it kind of moves with international global financial conditions. So it was around 2011, 2012, when the whole thing started to get a little bit shaky anyway. 2014 was the real inflection points. We're also writing a book about this. And 2014, 2015 is really the point where everything seems to change. We're not quite clear why, but we think it's to do with China. So 2015, China had a massive issue with the exchange rate, and we think it's really that's when it started. The whole thing is a little bit more volatile in Turkey, just because it's Turkey and Erdogan, but you can also see there has been some increase in the short-term financial assets and then decline. One thing that's very important to say, and for those of you who are working with firm level data, actually balance sheets data tell us so little about what firms are actually doing. And this is why we also felt we really needed these interviews, because if you look at the accounts, you're nodding, if you're looking at these accounts, I mean, they could be doing anything, honestly. And then you read the annual reports and it takes you years and you still don't understand what they're actually doing. So the kind of interviews were really also, I mean, I do interviews, but it was also partly just, come on, we need to understand what they're doing. So for example, actually in the Compostar data, and it was also the case in the Economatica data, which we used before, is that actually cash and short-term investments is one category. So it isn't even separated. So you don't really know whether what's happening in there is an increase in short-term financial assets, which would be more speculative and more interest rate yielding, or whether this is just an accumulation of cash. So it's really hard to even say that. The reason why we know this and we kind of claim it in the paper with some form of confidence is because we have national data in the context of Turkey. And in Turkey, we can really see that Turkish firms have substituted the holding of debt securities with the holding of cash. So they really hold very short-term liquid assets. And from the interviews, and also by looking at the financial accounts of some of these firms directly, the annual reports, because these are listed firms, we know that it's cash and not short-term financial assets. But from the accounts itself, and I think that's why, by doing that paper, we've become a little bit more critical on this financialization of the firm literature, because it's really sometimes very hard to know what's in there. Okay, so they have increased their financial assets, and they have borrowed increasingly more. Yeah, so what this shows you, again from Compostat and the Bank for International Settlement, it shows you short-term debt, which is the darker line, and it shows you long-term debt for Brazilian and Turkish non-financial corporations. Sorry, I should have said this is always as a share of total assets, both data. And you can see that particularly long-term debt increased from around 15% in Brazil to around 30%. It's slightly lower in Turkey, but it has probably increased even more markedly in Turkey. So we have seen this quite sustained increase in debt levels. Again, what we don't know is the currency contribution distribution of that, but we do know that a large share of this long-term debt, again anecdotally in reading the reports, is that a lot of that long-term debt is actually in foreign currency. So they have managed to issue more long-term rather than short-term has actually been declining, except here. But it's been in foreign currency, and the way you can also see this is actually through, there's quite a significant co-movement with the exchange rate. So we put the exchange rate in the graph, and you can see that long-term debt and the exchange rate do co-move to some extent, in the sense that when the exchange rate depreciates, of course the nominal amount of the debt increases just by the reasons for the exchange rate. Yes?
Regarding the currency decomposition, because we wrote a terminal about Turkey on this, and we tried to look at the BIS data
Yes.
on the currency composition. Did you try this too? Because I think it's in the Turkish context, it's also interesting because you have like the euro too, right?
Yes.
So I don't know, maybe you can elaborate a little bit if you
Yeah.
do this.
I have to say, I would have to ask Joel in that context. I think where you can get the currency composition, if I'm not completely wrong, is in the international debt securities, right? Which are the ones which are issued offshore, which of course is a very small proportion, and it's significant in the Brazilian case, but it's not very significant in the Turkish case. So that's the problem we have with these data. Yeah, we have, again for Turkey, we have much more detailed national data, and in Turkey we know the exchange, the distribution, and it's very often foreign currency. What is different, and I've got this on the slide, what is actually one of the important institutional differences is that really in Brazil, this borrowing has happened a lot offshore, through London, through Washington, through international financial subsidiaries. So Brazilian corporates have opened financial subsidiaries and issued debt offshore and brought the money back into Brazil, whereas the external borrowing in Turkey is really mainly through, and that's where the point about Europe comes in, it's mainly through foreign banks. So the Turkish system is much more bank-based still, but very much a foreign-dominated bank system, which can lend in foreign currency, which we should also say in Brazil, and that's really one of the amazing things the Brazilians have done, is they have managed to, and Bruno can talk a lot about that, they have really managed to avoid a dollarization of the domestic financial system, because they have forbidden any use of the dollar, both in deposits and lending, for a very long time. They're slowly changing that now. So there was a recent foreign exchange law. I think you probably can tell us more about that. I think they're very carefully, though, from what I understand from the central bank. So I think the central bank knows exactly what they're doing. I think so. I think so. But in Brazil, it wasn't. You couldn't use the foreign currency onshore. That's why the corporates who wanted to access cheaper financial markets have gone offshore. And that's one of the big institutional differences. But the underpinning, if you want, so the structures are the same. You have an increase in borrowing, and it's in foreign currency. So the vulnerability, the dollar vulnerability or foreign currency dependence, the vulnerability lies with the firms. And then I don't want to go so much into this in the presentation here, but we also see in both countries actually development banks and public banks have been quite important, particularly in that expansion phase. And again, the Brazilians in the room can tell us much more about that, but the BNDES, which is the Brazilian National Development Bank, has been a key lender, at least before the coup, to big Brazilian corporates, and has facilitated that expansion. Yeah. And I think one of the, please, we can discuss my sense, but one of the things Tema has really done, it has destroyed the BNDES, and which is a real shame. And you can see once these institutional structures are gone, they're gone. And I think, yeah, anyway, we can discuss this later. Right, so this is the first finding, and it's not surprising, but it echoes what we've seen in the literature. So we have seen an increase in cash holdings, and we have seen an increase in external borrowing. That borrowing has been in foreign currency. It's been slightly different in the two countries due to the institutional differences, but the pattern is the same, which left us with that puzzle of why are they doing this? And the question was, is the BIS right, and is this really speculative? Are they doing carry trade, or what are they actually doing? And we've looked at this from two ways. The first way, so we find is that, or we argue that actually this kind of firm behavior isn't in any shape or form paradoxical, but it's kind of rational if you're looking at this from this macrostructure context of international financial subordination. Because what we argue and what the interviews show is that this holding of financial assets wasn't really in securities, but it was in cash. And it was in cash, basically as a pillow of security to protect against the next financial shock. Yeah, because they had just been hit by the global financial crisis. They had just been hit with the European crisis. So basically, these firms, which were quite profitable during a few years, we have to say, when commodity prices were quite high, they were very profitable, but they kept these profits and didn't invest them, but they held them as a security pillow. And at the same time, they were borrowing in international financial markets, basically because they could. Yeah, we're dealing here with, again, in the context of subordination, with corporates which, under normal conditions, find themselves significantly finance constrained, where national banks are not lending to them, they're increasingly lending to consumers, bank credit, credit cards, etc., where very often they don't have any way of acquiring resources to do the investments, the mergers, acquisitions, whatever. So when international financial conditions are good, well, they go and borrow because that's when they get money. Okay, and I've got some quotes later to prove that. And that is also corroborated by the fact that on aggregate, and I think this is really important. Now, this is on aggregate, this is looking at all firms, which doesn't mean that there aren't a couple of firms which are doing a carry trade in there. There might be firms which have really clever or just quite daring risk officers and do the carry. But on aggregate, we don't see that, because on aggregate, these firms, particularly in Brazil, they have made financial losses. Okay, so we've got here the interest rate income and interest. So we have interest income and interest and related expensive, and you can see that the expenses in Brazil, which is the dashed line, is structurally higher than the income. So Brazilian firms have not made any money on that. They have made financial losses. I think at some points the Turkish firms were lucky. I'm not sure it was a strategy. They were probably just lucky. They made some financial income or financial profits, but very little. And it's the same. You can also look at non-operating income, which bunches together a lot of things. So it's with a lot of these things, it's not the best proxy, but it's not perfect, but it's a proxy. And you can see that non-operating income is also negative for both countries over the period. So this whole story about carry trade is just not something which we find holds in Brazilian and Turkish corporates. And it also, so it's not in the data, but it wasn't really in what the companies told us. So I've got a couple of quotes here. These are for the asset side. So where, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically maybe just the important thing is, I've highlighted it, where they say, so this is a large Brazilian company saying, but we try to maintain, as we say, whether we wanted it or not, the market associate, this is a, how shall we say, the company having a large cash mattress is a good sign. Security, yes, security, exactly. Okay, so they hold this as security purpose. At the same time, it's not just to protect against the next shock, but it's actually also a way of being able to access international financial markets. Because if you're holding cash, if you're holding particularly foreign currency cash, you are safe, yeah? And then you actually have the collateral, which allows you to go to international financial markets and borrow. So cash is both a security pillar, but is also a collateral. So only firms which have the cash flow and the ability to accumulate the collateral will be able to access international financial markets. And I come to that. That's the last finding which we have, which is about firm heterogeneity. So not every firm is the same, which it isn't in developed countries either, but it definitely isn't in Brazil and Turkey. And then just briefly a quote about the liabilities. Again, I'm not going to read it all, but basically what they say, so this is again a large Brazilian firm, they say, well, we should always go to the market when there is a market, because when there's a good market, there's a good deal. Yeah. So we have to borrow when we can. I'm not sure we can be very picky doing so. Yeah. So the message really is, this looking at this cash accumulation and the liabilities at the same time is in no way paradoxical, nor is it a carry trade, at least not in the aggregate. It's just rational behavior if you are operating under international financial subordination. Is it efficient? No, it's not. Because you're holding, like the Brazilian central bank, you're holding a lot of foreign exchange reserves. Now you have all these companies sitting on cash pillows, which, from a developmental perspective, they could invest, but they're not, because they're afraid that they might need it in case the next shock comes, or to be borrowing. Yeah. So again, if we think about this as a development scholars, it's actually a very wasteful exercise. But it's rational if you're if you're subordinate monetarily and international. Okay, and then the final results, and I'm coming to my hour, and I've indicated that, is that we find is that firm behavior isn't the same. And actually what we find is that there's quite heterogeneous firm behavior, and that there are only very few firms who are actually able to engage in financial operations, particularly if they involve international financial markets. So if we look at the borrowing side of things, the raising debt on international financial markets. And what we argue is that actually this firm behavior, or the ability to access international financial markets, is fundamentally shaped by these countries' balance of payments constraint and dualistic production structure. Or in other words, only those firms which are able to credibly generate the cash flow, either in foreign currency or in local currency, but can convert it, are the ones which are able to access international financial markets. So dualistic production structures, we're drawing here on Latin American structuralist theories, dualistic production structures are reflected in dualistic financialization of financial behavior. And I think if you ask me what's the key conceptual thing coming out of this paper, then I think it's that. And that links to our comment about we need to look at production and finance in symbiosis, because financialization behavior in the Global South will be dualistic, it will be heterogeneous, because the underlying economies are. Because you have got a few big firms which can play internationally, which sometimes even now on the technological frontier until they are destroyed, like Embraer. But you also have a lot of small companies who can hardly access financial markets, which are the mainstay of employment. Yeah. So what we then show more concretely is that actually foreign borrowing is dominated by very few large firms, and really in the Brazilian case, it's probably a handful, and certain sectors. And they're particularly in both countries, so we're showing here the number of Brazilian Turkish firms issuing foreign currency denominated bonds per sector, is dominated by a few sectors. It's consumer staples, it's energy and power, yeah, and it's materials. So it's not the high technological frontier. It's, this is comparative advantage, okay? And so what we argue is that, in a way, particularly in the Brazilian case, the firms which were able to borrow internationally and play with financial markets were basically, firms in existing comparative advantage sectors, which in Brazil are increasingly, again, in the process of deindustrialization, commodity-related sectors. So, for example, 36% of the lending for the borrowing. And I appreciate these are also partly public firms, but we can come back to that. Petrobras, which is energy and petroleum, Vale, which is materials, and JBS, which is a meat company, which took the lion's share of the international issues. And we again have a little quote here to show that, you know, it's those firms which have the cash flow and hold dollars which can access international financial markets. In Turkey, because Turkey has a structural current account deficit, and Turkey doesn't really have, I don't know, are there any Turkish students in the room? Or somebody who knows Turkey very well? Okay, yeah. So what Elif tells me, it's not as clear, so they don't have this kind of, you know, more resource commodity-based comparative advantage. But what you could see in Turkey is that really the sectors that were able to borrow were the ones with explicit state support. Yeah, so it's where the state, under Erdogan, under the specific accumulation regime, construction-based, services-based, it was those companies which through state support could guarantee a secure cash flow were the ones which were able to borrow, which was manufacturing, but I showed a decline, transportation, energy, particularly construction, and a little bit of telecommunication. Yeah. So maybe just briefly to show you, these are the sectors. In Brazil, it's particularly petroleum, so this is Petrobras. But maybe most interestingly, you can see in Turkey, the gray line is construction. And you can see how in 2010, construction companies were nearly equal, blue is manufacturing companies, were equal borrowing internationally in Turkey. Yeah. And so the kind of the final conceptual contribution of the paper then to say is that, and that goes back to the point of the state, is that in the global south, more so, and I think I would stay firm with that, more so than in developed countries, the state plays a crucial role in enabling, mediating, and shaping financialization in the context of international financial subordination. And it has done that in different ways, through public-private partnerships, public development banks, regulations. So the state allowed the Turkish companies to borrow in foreign currency for a while. But it's through the state for support, and now we have another lovely quote here. It's through the state support and guaranteeing the cash flow that in countries where maybe the comparative advantage isn't as given as in Brazil, but even in Brazil, the state plays this specific role to do that. But, and this is really where Elif's work comes in, but it's also contradictory, because the state, it's not just a constrained agent, but it's also one that navigates different interests and class relations. And whilst on the one hand, the Turkish state has enabled the participation of its large firms and its large capital in global financial markets, it also then had to restrict it again once financial fragility took overhand and the next financial crisis was around the corner. Okay, and I think that's it. So maybe just to summarize what the paper does, it tries to speak to the literature on corporate financialization. It wants to look at it in the context of developing and emerging countries. It argues, shows, demonstrates that, you know, firm financial behavior really is shaped by this integration into hierarchic international monetary financial systems. So we really need to look at these macro financial structures. And as a development scholar, this is one of the things that in a way grates most, that all this kind of neoclassical or mainstream development journals have gone so micro. You know, you have randomized control trials, you've got all the looking at poverty, but actually acknowledging the macro structures, which are so fundamental for any development initiative, are completely sidelined. And that's really, I think it's really problematic. Yeah, and then just to repeat the point about the dualistic productive structures, which are reflected in the nature of financialization and the contradictory role of the state. And one bullet point that I finish every presentation with is that, we need some public finance, because financial markets, private financial markets, are not quite going to do it, particularly if we most need it. Right, I'm all done.